In his promotional tour for All the President's Men, Robert Redford was asked what was at the root of his animus towards President Richard Nixon.
He was a man who was not telling us the truth. He was also a man that seemed very inhuman. He seemed to be screened against humanity.
Redford replied that he had met Nixon once as a child. He was meant to receive an award.
He had given me an award once when I was very young. I was about 13. And when he handed me the award, there was nothing happening.
The explanation Redford gives is fascinating. It's at once a window into his own thinking, and I think a method by which we can understand the perception of Richard Nixon as a whole. That Nixon, according to him, was going through the motions of the ceremony, and it seemed to Redford that he had no life behind his eyes.
And I thought, that's really incredible. I remembered that about him, that I had absolutely no contact with the man whatsoever.
This, I think, is a revealing comment from a celebrity filmmaker. First of all, we're meant to believe that Robert Redford has some extrasensory perception, an ability to see into the soul, to perceive people's true nature. But this is all based around an experience he had as a child. I think a much more logical explanation for the perceived deficit of interest for the young Redford is that Richard Nixon was probably very busy while holding office, and probably didn't give a fuck about handing Redford his award. But presidents handing out awards, meeting football teams, and giving speeches is really part of the gig, because in America, so much of how we feel about our leaders is based on perception, surface-level performance. Which is why I think that Kennedy, FDR, Ronald Reagan are remembered so fondly, and Nixon is not. Recently, YouGov compiled a poll and found that Richard Nixon still ranked at the very bottom of the list when it came to Americans' perceptions of former presidents. And if you ask someone to name one thing they remember about him, they'd probably say Watergate, which is, of course, a stain on his presidency. Watergate is so often used as a kind of shorthand, almost a lexicon, to explain every media development and social change of the 1970s and beyond. I do think the American public was essentially traumatized or brain-warped by the idea of Watergate. There's a whole raft of 1970s conspiracy films that derive their power from an ambient feeling of dread, paranoia, and mistrust in the government post the assassinations of the 60s and Watergate, especially in the film we're about to discuss today, All the President's Men. All the President's Men is a very good movie, a terrific film, incredibly well shot and acted. It takes a very complex subject and makes it understandable and engaging, simplifying it while still making the audience feel smart for understanding it. As the New York Times noted in its review, the film was, quote, a spellbinding detective story and an unequivocal smash hit, the thinking man's Jaws. All the President's Men was an incredible pressure relief valve, the culmination of all the 1970s conspiracy films that tapped into a feeling of malaise, disorganization, and helplessness in the American populace. All of it retroactively attributed to Nixon and Watergate, which was, at its core, a relatively minor scheme involving rogue underlings in his administration spying on the Democratic headquarters. Nixon's biggest mistake in the entire Watergate fiasco was that he didn't want to throw people under the bus. He didn't want to throw them to the wolves. He thought he could just move past it, and therefore he covered up the scandal. For that, he was politically and socially crucified. All the President's Men is a fantastic movie, and we're going to discuss it today. We will also touch on Nixon's peculiar place as a singular cinematic president, mostly due to the sheer amount of films that wrangle with his legacy. The film begins with a blank white screen, fuzzy, indeterminable. It's a piece of paper. We don't know that until it's stamped hard by a type slug, which signifies the press, the power and energy of their typed letters, letters giving form to a formerly shapeless void, just as the journalists in the film will forcefully bring order to an unseen reality. The film then cuts to Nixon's State of the Union address. Rather than presenting the footage cleanly, Pakula frames it through the glow of a television set, complete with analog fuzz, scan lines, and visual noise, as an ordinary American would have seen it. It's a subtle but important choice. Nixon enters the Capitol in triumph, greeted with ceremony and applause, assuming the role of confident commander-in-chief before Congress. But the film alters how we experience the moment. With the benefit of hindsight, Pakula recasts this all as a big facade, a big show masking the treachery beneath. The credits roll over a sustained sequence of the fated Watergate break-in. It's shot with elegant aplomb by the Prince of Darkness himself, Gordon Willis. It's a masterful moment, watching the clandestine break-in in a very unromantic and matter-of-fact way, because in the grand scheme of things, the act itself was somewhat unspectacular. It was just a few middle-aged guys in suits breaking into an office with flashlights and walkie-talkies. The political severity of the moment make all of this more eerie. In their book, All the President's Men, Woodward and Bernstein describe the Watergate complex as futuristic, with its serpent teeth, concrete balustrades, and equally menacing prices. It had become the symbol of the ruling class in Richard Nixon's Washington. And I actually went to Watergate recently, attempting to give you guys a little something extra, a little production value, and it didn't go very well for me. It was incredibly windy, and I was interrupted constantly. Apparently, it's a very busy street.
That's where it all happened, dude. Yeah. That's where it all happened.
But there is something very eerie about the place. Something that makes you want to kind of meander around and think. Overall, I enjoyed going there. The Watergate complex is futuristic, but it's a future that never came to pass. Perhaps had Nixon not suffered his fate, the Watergate complex would have been the template for a new America. But alas, it's simply a testament to the tragedy of Richard Nixon. The break-in team unload a bag with their latex gloves, the specter of John F. Kennedy looming over them. An unassuming guy in a white t-shirt monitors the situation from an apartment building across the street. Plainclothes police then enter the building in a sequence redolent of Hitchcock's Rear Window. We monitor their progress from a high vantage point.
Hold it, you must hold! Police! Put your hands up!
We are introduced to our heroes, Woodward and Bernstein, as well as the now famous Washington Post offices. The set was essentially a one-for-one recreation of the real-world location. It cost Warner's $500,000 and was built on a very large soundstage. The film was originally envisioned as a black-and-white documentary-style, low-budget film that Redford would produce. He actually worked with Woodward and Bernstein prior to the release of their book, as he was an avid follower of all their developments prior to Nixon resigning and Watergate being blown open.
Up to that point, I had been mostly interested as a private citizen. Then I became interested from the standpoint of it being possible film material.
The Warner producers sort of nudged Redford into starring. I'm assuming or guessing that was because he looks just enough like Woodward, and Redford agreed, thus juicing the project with lots of money. And so began the search for a name actor who looked just enough like Bernstein, and they landed on Dustin Hoffman. As far as the public is concerned, Redford and Hoffman, their depictions of these people in the film, might as well be what Woodward and Bernstein actually looked like. It's the actor's image that takes up mental space in the minds of the public. I think people are confused because of the insane accuracy of the newspaper set and how photos of the actual journalists look like screenshots from the film. So they kind of blur together. Another big L for Richard Nixon, as he has to carry on looking like he actually looked, while in the mind of the public, he was taken down by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. This puts Nixon at a severe disadvantage. And for the most part, I feel like Hoffman and Redford lean on their star personas to carry the personality of the journalists. It's not like the real-life duo were bountiful fonts of charisma. You watch the two of them on Firing Line with William F. Buckley, and it's almost like they're interchangeable. So for a procedural film like this, which is not interested in the characters' personal lives at all, for the actors to just kind of play reserved and serious versions of themselves, with some small exceptions, I think that for the most part works. It's the rest of the office, the editors, who are the real characters. Jason Robards as Ben Bradley, Jack Warden and Martin Balsam. They're all very convincing as hard-nosed newspapermen from another era. And Woodward and Bernstein, the upstart new generation.
You know, I'm glad you asked me that question. The reason I'm glad you asked me is because if you had asked Simons or Bradley, they would have said, you know, we're going to have to fire this schmuck at once because he's so dumb.
The Watergate burglars arrive at their summary hearing, and Woodward begins to realize that something is off when a few of them claim they were employed formerly by the CIA. It also turns out that one of the burglars had the number for E. Howard Hunt in his address book. Hunt was one of the White House plumbers, tasked with stemming a series of leaks coming out of the White House. Hunt was eventually unmasked as one of the orchestrators of the burglary, but initially Woodward and Bernstein spent a lot of time digging into whether or not he checked out books on Ted Kennedy.
The White House is real paranoid about Teddy Kennedy. I remember seeing a book about Chappaquiddick on his desk, and he was always getting material out of the White House library and the Library of Congress, and Anything he could find.
The movie spends a lot of time on this.
Hi, this is Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, and I was just wondering if you can remember any books that Howard Hunt checked out on Senator Kennedy.
These were more naive political times, and I suppose we are to infer that Woodward and Bernstein were trying to establish a pattern of paranoia in the White House by digging into Hunt's reading history. Why would anyone want to check out multiple books on or collect information about their political opponents? Yeah, I wonder. Today we would call this opposition research, but the movie makes it seem like a big deal, and so you just kind of go with it.
All White House transactions are confidential. Thank you very much, John.
This impressive shot of Woodward and Bernstein in the Library of Congress, the camera dollying out from the ceiling, hung precariously by a steel cable, an incredibly difficult shoot to orchestrate, revealing the large Byzantine maze-like structure of the Library of Congress as our heroes do the hard, grunt reporting of verifying checkout cards, is one of the great moments in the movie. For one, it's visually impressive. For another, it's become a kind of shorthand for the film, for the story, a visual representation of the tireless work of these two reporters, surrounded by the immense system of Washington, D.C., and the American political machine, embodied in the anonymous grandiosity of the Library of Congress. Most people don't remember that the scene is ultimately totally pointless because the lead goes nowhere, and finding out whether or not a Republican is doing research on a Democrat or vice versa is, 1, not a crime, number 2, not really all that unusual, number 3, slanderous to suggest otherwise. But that's what the movie does, and it's one of the most iconic moments in the film. The real break in the story occurs when Bernstein uncovers the thread that really broke Watergate open. He flies down to Florida to have a verbal spat with sweaty Floridian lawyer Ned Beatty, which ultimately leads to the discovery that former Attorney General John Mitchell was using funds donated to the committee to re-elect the president as a slush fund paid in checks to the plumbers and, in turn, Watergate burglars to carry out less than legal operations. The duo begin tracking down employees at Creep, endeavoring to get them on the record. The process of acquiring sources, which we are shown, requires not just tenacity, but once you get someone to talk, a journalist needs to put on their therapist hat. This is another one of the film's real appeals. It's willing to show the audience in interesting ways how the less than romantic work of the journalist is done. It makes you feel smart to observe. I mean, this isn't some schmuck adventure picture where James Cagney sneaks into the apartment and gets the story via gumshoe chicanery. No, this is real journalism, the real stuff. These, pedestrian interview segments of the film make the moments with the legendary Deep Throat really hit. Deep Throat is the key to making all this work. I don't just mean the movie, but the legend of Watergate as a whole. Deep Throat was this mysterious government man in the shadows, a real-life spy, someone who spoke cryptically in dimly lit parking garages, only the ember from his cigarette to illuminate his mysterious visage. Deep Throat went on to serve as proof that conspiracies were real, that there was a secret war within the power structure between white hats and black hats, and who knows what the black hats had been up to. And because he was an anonymous source, the mind reels. Woodward was bound by the oath of journalistic integrity not to reveal very much about him. No, the business of Watergate was much too serious, much too earth-shattering. The meetings had to be clandestine, subterranean. And Hal Holbrook? He's such an original stock American aristocrat, standing in stark relief to the knuckle-dragging thugs working for Nixon. Nixon, whose upper lip was so sweaty on national television. Now, in reality, Deep Throat was a guy named Mark Felt. Maybe he was a noble do-gooder, but I'm more inclined to believe Pat Buchanan's interpretation of Felt's motivations, which to me appear plausible. Felt had his own motive. He was linking to Woodward to make acting director Pat Gray, who trusted Felt, appear too incompetent to keep FBI secrets, and thus get Gray shoved aside in favor of Mark Felt as director of the FBI.
Your lives are in danger.
Were they, though? Woodward never made this claim in the book. Deep Throat only told him to be cautious. Afterwards, Woodward details how he and Bernstein in the Post undertook impressive efforts to thwart potential bugging of the paper, and in the end, they realized they were overreacting. This whole piece here is really pretty irresponsible on the part of Pakula and Redford, and for a film that, as the New York Times purported, was for the thinking man, completely discredits itself, and its aspiration to convey, quote, the most devastating detective story of the century, instead reveals itself to be a sensational piece of propaganda. As I said before, the revelation of Watergate and its subsequent cinematic adaptation was a pressure relief valve for the public, the culmination of films like Pakula's own excellent The Parallax View, which concludes that the structure is too complicated and the truth will be suppressed, that we will never be able to achieve justice, or even kooky hokum like executive action, a risible waste of time, the favorite film of cult leader Jim Jones that chalked up the Kennedy assassination to a conspiracy of East Coast WASP conservative businessmen. Watergate was revealed. The air was cleared, and everybody had their scapegoat for every harebrained anxiety and suspicion that had been building and building throughout the 60s. But I would argue that the driving force behind America's malaise, behind American confusion, was not simply Watergate. It was that the United States government fundamentally changed during and after World War II. It became more bureaucratic, more secretive, because America itself was becoming more powerful. It had to become the world's superpower. And with that came trade-offs. Look at Marathon Man, one of the few 70s conspiracy films to go right to the source and identify the nexus of all our paranoia. It's in World War II and its fallout. How the pain of that war still resonated, perhaps unseen or not understood at the time. Nixon was burned at the stake for having happened to be the man sitting in the Oval Office while the country underwent that transformation. Oliver Stone's Nixon hints at this, at Nixon trapped in a bureaucracy. It's a little on the nose, but it drives the point home.
What's the point of being president? You're powerless.
No, I'm not powerless. Because I understand the system. I believe I can control it. Maybe not control it totally, but tame it enough to make it do some good.
Sounds like you're talking about a wild animal.
Yeah, maybe I am.
And I like Stone's film. While the movie is frenetic, experimental, and not exactly cohesive, ironically, it's the most subtle and even-handed portrayal of the president we are likely to get out of Hollywood. It's also larger than life and exciting, bombastic even. Even if Stone, a conspiracy-afflicted individual, can't help but include JFK assassination gibberish and shoehorn it into the Nixon story. Nixon was a thoughtful man whom many presidents sought out for advice, especially during the late 70s and 80s when tensions with the Soviet Union were rising. He's impugned as secretive, furtive, obsessed, paranoid, when he really had every right to be. Robert Altman's repetitive slog, Secret Honor, hits us over the head with this one. Nixon was paranoid, forever distraught over his perception by the elite as being lower class, a farmer's son from Whittier, California. Altman has his Nixon impotently lash out at the elite of America. Essentially, the director mocks him for having this inferiority complex, a complex that Altman exploits to punish Nixon for his treachery. I don't even think Hitler would be plausibly subjected to the treatment Altman reserved for Nixon in this film. Is it my intention with this video to hijack what is supposed to be a movie review to rehabilitate Nixon or to say that he did nothing wrong? Not really, but the movie is such a political act in and of itself, it's hard to separate the two. All the President's Men was part of the media machine / myth-making operation that was arrayed against the former president. The film, and this is one of its core appeals as a narrative, positions Woodward and Bernstein as the ultimate underdogs, not unlike the formula that Rocky followed the very same year. There are many moments like the Library of Congress scene. In fact, it's a running visual motif of the film, Woodward and Bernstein moving about a massive impersonal complex, framed as small elements of a much larger whole, facing down the tremendous power of the Nixon administration, when in fact they had a media machine chomping at the bit for Nixon and Hollywood in tow at their backs. Do we need another essay review critic to heap praise on this film and parrot lines about speaking truth to power? Watergate, as I think I've touched on, is a sort of load-bearing myth in the American psyche. One of the most important things it allows for is for those in power to point to the one time a president was held accountable for something and prove that the system works. Nixon, if you'll forgive the analogy, died for a lot of people's sins in Washington. This is a movie that has a lot of power, and like I said, it's a very good film. Let's just not pretend it didn't have partisan ulterior motives. Strategically released before the 1976 election between Ford and Carter, and just in time to coincide with Woodward and Bernstein's follow-up book, The Final Days, which was released 3 weeks later. While Woodward and Bernstein were flying high, Nixon had staved off retributive calls for his imprisonment and racked up millions in dollars in legal debt defending himself from vicious lawsuits coming from every direction, the details of which are painfully recounted in his autobiography, In the Arena. Nixon made a mistake. Leaders aren't supposed to do that, or they're supposed to be strong enough not to be caught. Nixon reminds us of ourselves, which is why we scorn him.
When I read Wired, the book written by, Woodward, about Belushi, I read like 5 pages of Wired, and I went, oh my God, they framed Nixon.
I wouldn't go this far, but it's directionally correct.